Welcome to today's deep dive. We're going to be looking into pretty controversial territory, actually. President Trump's pardons.
Mm,
Yeah,
excellent.
related to the January 6th Capitol riot.
Okay.
Our main source today is going to be a factcheck.org article. It's from January 24th, 2025, and it really breaks down the justifications given for these pardons.
Interesting.
Over 1,500 people
Wow.
connected to the January 6th events received clemency from Trump, and we're going to be analyzing some of the claims made to defend those actions.
The use of language is really fascinating in this whole thing, how it's being used to shape the narrative.
Yeah, you're right. One of the first things that jumps out at me is the use of the word hostages.
Right.
Trump uses that word over and over again
Yeah.
to describe those who were jailed for January 6th offenses.
Okay.
But, does that word really reflect what happened?
Well, I mean, the fact check article highlights a pretty stark contrast, I'd say.
Yeah.
We're talking the vast majority of those who were incarcerated,
Mm-hmm.
like close to 400 of them.
What?
They either plead guilty or were found guilty in court.
Right, and it's not like we're talking about, parking tickets here.
Right.
Over 327 plead guilty to felonies.
Yeah, serious crimes.
And 172 of those specifically were for assaulting law enforcement officers.
Mm.
So is calling these people hostages,
Right.
doesn't that kind of minimize what happened?
It definitely raises the question of why that specific language is being used and what effect it might have on how the public perceives it all.
Right. Could it be like an attempt to make people feel sorry for them?
Exactly. Or to kind of discredit the legal process.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's definitely something to think about. And this hostage thing, it's not the only instance where language is used to kind of downplay what happened on January 6th.
Right.
Trump also refers to all the violence against law enforcement as very minor incidents.
Very minor incidents.
Yeah,
But the Justice Department reports tell a totally different story.
right.
Over 140 officers were injured, and some were hurt pretty badly. Concussions.
Wow.
One even had a heart attack.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, and there was an officer who lost a fingertip.
The article also mentions the officer who was crushed in a doorway
Oh, gosh.
and another who was choked on the ground. I mean,
That's awful.
these don't sound like minor incidents to me.
Not at all.
It seems like there's a real attempt here to downplay the violence.
It's really interesting how those two, contrasting narratives, like hostages versus people convicted of crimes, minor incidents versus these brutal attacks, how they can shape how we see things so differently. What stands out to you about this?
I think it's just how easily these labels get slapped onto these really complex situations,
All
Like
right.
the language itself is trying to tell us what to think instead of letting us work through the nuances of what happened.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And that becomes even more clear, I think, when we look at those claims about outside agitators and the FBI being involved.
Ah, yes, the conspiracy theories.
Right.
Trump's implying that these mysterious outside agitators were the ones who actually started the violence. And he even suggests that the FBI might have been involved somehow.
Oh, wow.
But the fact check article debunks all of that.
They do.
Yeah, they cite a report from the DOJ Inspector General.
Okay.
And it found no evidence at all.
None.
None. No evidence of undercover FBI agents or informants encouraging people to break the law.
Wow.
And in fact, out of all 26 FBI informants who were there that day, not one of them was told to break the law or tell other people to.
That's really interesting. So if there's no evidence to support these claims, then why even bring them up?
Exactly why. Could it be a way to shift the blame away from the people who were actually charged and convicted for the attack?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And I think it leads us into some pretty murky waters.
Yeah.
When we look at this in the bigger picture of politics,
Hmm.
we can see how these claims might be used to push certain agendas, to control the story in a way that benefits a particular viewpoint.
It's almost like the truth itself doesn't matter as much as the story that's being told, which is kind of scary when you think about it.
Yeah. It really shows the power of these stories, especially in a world where we have so much information available, but it's so easy to manipulate it.
Speaking of manipulation, Trump also makes these kind of strange comparisons between the sentences that were given to the January 6th rioters
Ugh.
and sentences for murder.
Murder.
Yeah, he says that some January 6th participants were getting these really long sentences while some murderers don't even get any time.
Wow.
He even specifically mentions Philadelphia and Los Angeles.
Interesting.
But once again, fact check comes in with a reality check.
Okay.
They point out that the average murder sentence, according to the Department of Justice, is actually around 50 years.
50 years.
Yeah, in state prisons. And then in states like Pennsylvania, first and second degree murder come with a mandatory life sentence.
Wow.
And then in California, which is where Los Angeles is, it's at least 15 years for second-degree murder and 25 for first degree.
So these claims that murderers are just walking free, especially in those specific places, it's just not true.
Not at all. It seems like a clear attempt to make the January 6 actions seem less serious than they really were.
It is. It's creating this false equivalence.
Yeah. It's amazing how these comparisons can really mess with our understanding of how the justice system works.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if this is intentional, a deliberate attempt to make people lose trust in the legal process.
It's definitely possible. Which brings us to a really important question. What is the motivation behind making these comparisons?
Yeah.
What purpose do they serve in this whole narrative that's being built around January 6th and the pardons?
That's a question we'll keep exploring as we dig deeper into this whole complicated and controversial issue.
It is complicated.
In the next part of our deep dive, we're going to be looking at who specifically got these pardons and what the implications might be both for them and for the future of American democracy.
I'm interested to hear it.
Yeah, it should be interesting.
Looking forward to it.
So we were just talking about how some of the reasons given for those January 6th pardons, they kind of twist the reality of what happened.
Totally. It's a tactic that's used a lot to try to make things seem less serious than they really are. And in this case, with an attack on the Capitol, an attack on democracy itself, it's really worrying.
Right. And it makes you wonder what message is being sent. Does it mean that accountability and the rule of law are flexible, like they can be bent depending on the situation?
It definitely raises those questions.
Yeah.
And it's even more confusing when you think about how Trump seemed to be making a distinction at first between the people involved in the riot based on how violent they were.
Yeah, you're right. The article mentions how during his campaign, and even as recently as December, he was saying he'd look at each case individually and take into account the difference between those who weren't violent and those who were out of control.
There's even a quote from his running mate, J.D. Vance, just a week before the inauguration, saying that those who used violence on January 6th obviously shouldn't be pardoned.
But then the proclamation grants clemency to everyone charged with offenses related to the Capitol riot, including those who were found guilty of violence against law enforcement. It's like a complete 180 from what he was saying before. What do you think caused this change?
It's hard to know for sure. Could it have been some kind of political strategy? Or maybe he was pressured by certain groups?
It's really strange. And it gets even weirder when you look at who actually got pardoned. The article points out that 14 people connected to the Oath Keepers and Proud Boys, those extremist groups, charged with planning the attack.
Right.
They had their sentences commuted. Can you remind us what commuted means in this context?
Sure. So a commutation means their prison sentences were shortened, but their convictions still stand. They're basically being let out of prison early.
So they're free even though they were found guilty of serious crimes related to the attack on the Capitol. And then on top of that, there's a blanket pardon for over 1,500 others who were charged with offenses related to the riots.
And that includes those who hadn't even gone to trial yet. Plus, Trump ordered that anyone who was still in prison should be released immediately.
Wow, that's a huge move. What are the consequences of such a broad pardon, especially when it includes people convicted of violence? Does this set a dangerous example?
It's definitely complicated and has a lot of implications. One thing to think about is how it affects public trust in the justice system. When people see a pardon on this scale, particularly when it includes people who committed violent crimes, it can erode faith in the idea that everyone is equal under the law. It makes people wonder if the system is really fair and impartial.
And what about the people who were directly affected by the violence on January 6th? The police officers who were injured, the lawmakers who were afraid for their lives, the families of those who died that day. How do you think they feel about these pardons?
It's hard to imagine what they must be going through. There's probably a sense of betrayal, a feeling that their suffering is being minimized, and a fear that justice hasn't been served. These pardons reopen old wounds and highlight how deeply divided our society still is.
It feels like this goes beyond just legal technicalities.
Right.
We're dealing with fundamental questions about accountability, the rule of law, and what it means to uphold justice in a democracy.
Exactly.
Right.
And it brings us back to why that factcheck.org article is so important. They're focusing on debunking the reasons given for these pardons. They're carefully examining the facts and showing where things are inaccurate or distorted. It reminds us how important it is to think critically and find trustworthy sources of information.
Especially these days when there's so much misinformation and disinformation out there, we can't just passively absorb information. We have to actively question what we hear, double-check our sources, and base our understanding on evidence, not just rhetoric.
Exactly. It's about empowering ourselves to be informed citizens who can navigate this complicated world of information and come to our own conclusions.
So after this deep dive into these pardons and the reasons behind them, I'm left wondering, what kind of lasting impact will this have on American politics?
Well, there's no doubt that these pardons have stirred up a lot of debate and controversy, and it's unlikely that the conversation will die down anytime soon. In the final part of our deep dive, we'll explore the potential long-term effects of these pardons and how they might shape the future of American democracy.
We've really been digging into these January 6th pardons, looking at the explanations for them, and comparing them to the facts presented by factcheck.org. It seems pretty clear these pardons are more than just legal actions. They're symbolic gestures that could have big consequences.
You're right. These pardons have started so many conversations and arguments, and they're forcing us to really think about accountability, justice, and what democracy even means. It's like they're making us look in the mirror and think about what we believe in.
It's striking to me how different groups of people might see these pardons. I can't imagine everyone having the same reaction to something this controversial.
Definitely. Some people might see these pardons as like a win for freedom, like a pushback against a legal system that's gone too far and is too political. They might think it's righting a wrong or standing up for those who are unfairly targeted.
But then others will probably see this as a really dangerous thing to do, like ignoring the law and disrespecting those who were hurt on January 6th. The pain and trauma from that day are still raw for a lot of people, and these pardons could make them feel like their experiences are being ignored.
It's important to see both sides of this. It's not a simple issue.
Yeah.
The tough part is figuring out how to talk about these really different opinions and have meaningful conversations that go beyond the oversimplified stories we often hear.
That's so true. We need to resist just staying in our own bubbles and instead try to understand different perspectives, even the ones we don't agree with. How can we as a society bridge these gaps and actually talk about sensitive issues like this?
I think it starts with understanding that these pardons affect more than just the people who are pardoned. We're dealing with the possibility of losing trust in our institutions, the widening of divisions in society, and what this all means for how we talk about politics in the future.
That factcheck.org article has been super helpful in sorting through this whole situation. By carefully checking the facts and explanations given for the pardons, they're giving us a way to tell what's true from what's not.
Exactly. It highlights how important it is to have reliable sources, especially when we're surrounded by misleading stories and straight-up lies. It reminds us that we can't just blindly believe everything we hear. We have to think critically, evaluate our sources, and question what we're told.
So as we finish up this deep dive, I'm left thinking about what we can learn from all of this. What takeaways can help us understand and handle the complexities of our current political and social climate?
Maybe the most important thing to remember is that we have to stay alert and informed. We have to keep searching for truth, justice, and accountability. We have to make sure our leaders are responsible for what they do and demand that they are transparent. The future of our democracy relies on people being informed and engaged and willing to ask tough questions and challenge the way things are.
That's a great point to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into President Trump's January 6th pardons. We hope you'll continue to look into this important issue and have thoughtful conversations with those around you. We'll be back next week with another deep dive into a new topic, so stay curious and keep learning.